tell, do you see the road? I'm out to my soul into the size whenever the smoke clear out of my face and my picture perfect.
Hello and welcome back, fellow anime lovers, to Cypherfics. I am delighted to have you join us once again in the world of fanfiction and fantasy. This is the fourth part of, What If Harry Potter Meets Twilight? Special note, this fanfic is written and a masterpiece of Asian Lion Heart 310 on fanfiction.net. Do check and support the author too. Now smash the like, share and subscribe button for more. Also press the bell icon so that you never miss such great parts. Thanks for the introduction. Now let's dive into the world. Harold fell on the sofa with a relieved sigh. He had just finished with his luggages and exhaustion was taking over his body. 1 hour had passed since Einar left and the dark brown-haired man had twice tried to call for Ayanna but not once did she answer him. Not that he was worried as she was either sleeping or sleeping. She and him had the same age after all and they would die at the same time thanks to their bond. Then something came to his mind. There is one place in the house he hadn't visited yet, the garage. Going back on his feet, Harold opened the black door near the chimney before turning on the light. A gasp escaped his throat at what he saw. The garage was pretty big in the inside with shelves filled with different stuff such as rods, hooks, coolers for putting fishes in etc. But it wasn't what had caught his attention. It was what was standing between him and the shelves. It was a motorcycle but not any motorcycle. A black Harley-Davidson. His blue-green eyes were filled with stars of pleasure but then he noticed something on the motorcycle, a note. Curious, he picked it up before smiling tenderly when he recognized his mother's handwriting. Hello son. If you are reading, then you are in Forks and not in Montana with me anymore. It hurt me deeply to see you away from me and if I had a choice, I would keep you with me but it would not be good for you like me and my ancestors before me. It is time for you to become independent. But enough of sad thoughts. If you are reading this, I'm sure you have discovered my little gift for you. I hope you like it because I had a really hard time to find it. I also hope you like your new home even if I'm not in it with you. Your grandparents and myself, along with Uncle Einar, did our very best to make it cozier than he was. Believe me when I said it was anything but welcoming at first. So much spiders yuck. Anyway, another thing I want to say is this. You have been enrolled in Forks High School but sadly, you cannot come until the spring semester in January, I'm afraid. I hope you enjoy your new life as an adult, Harold, my beloved son. Your mother. Astrid. P.S. Look into the first room. Behind the bed is something that your great-grandfather left behind for any werebears who came to live in his former home. P.P.S. Don't forget to call me anytime, young man. Harold couldn't retain a soft laugh to escape his mouth as he finished reading the letter as a few tears fell down his cheeks. Shaking his head, he returned back to the main part of the house before heading toward the kitchen as his stomach started to growl loudly in hunger. Thanks to his family, he had enough food for a while, maybe 2 or 3 months at most, so he won't have to do purchases anytime soon. Smiling, the young man started to work on one of his favorite meals, baked pork chops. For Ayanna, he decided to prepare her some trouts he found in the cooler. She will surely love them enveloped in honey. After a few minutes, the 2 meals were finished and he purposely let the kitchen's door open so Ayanna would grace him with his presence after being silent since the moment she went upstairs. Like he predicted, the sound of heavy footsteps climbing down the staircase announced him the arrival of his familiar, whose head soon appeared at the kitchen's entrance. Well, look who decided to mingle back with the commoner, Harold teasingly greeted the blonde bear who shot him a glare. Ah ha ha, I'm literally dying of laughter. Ayanna replied in sarcasm at her human who couldn't stop himself from laughing. Seriously, what were you doing up there? I didn't hear you for a while, you know. I was starting to worry, Harold said softly after a moment. The glare she had in her eyes softened drastically at those words before she answered in a kind but sheepish tone. I'm sorry for worrying you. I found this moss bed and I kinda fell asleep on it. Harold stared blankly at his familiar for a moment before chuckling as he said those next words. You really are a groundhog, you know. A deep growl escaped the blonde bear's throat as she glared daggers at her humans. But then a devious smirk grew on her muzzle as she knew the perfect way to punish him for this. "I will show you a groundhog, you hairless monkey." Ayanna snarled playfully back at her human before lunging forward. Harold yelped in shock and surprise at the sudden attack and found himself being pinned down by the large grizzly bear who opened her jaws to lick his face repeatedly, covering his skin with her thick warm saliva. "Ugh! Stop that!" The dark brown-haired man cried out loudly in disgust as he tried to push the heavy bear away from him. Instead of listening, Ayanna's licks doubled and Harold closed his eyes and mouth when her tongue touched his lips or his eyelids. For at least 4 minutes, she kept licking until she finally thought it was time to let him up. Harold used a hand to weep the drill out of his face, groaning in disgust while the blonde grizzly bear only stood there watching him with a satisfied expression on her face. "I really need a shower now, all thanks to you." The dark brown-haired young man grumbled in annoyance as he shot a glare toward the bear who only giggled in amusement. "You're welcome. Now can we eat?" Ayanna inquired to her human with a hopeful expression in her eyes. Of course, right after I come back from the shower, Harold's response caused her to gap at him before growling threateningly. "We eat now or I'm giving you another reason to head to the shower, Harold Anderson." Ayanna growled at him and his face paled a bit at those words, especially when he saw her licking her chops in anticipation. "Fine, you big glutton. You won." Harold grumbled in defeat before going back to the plates of food, leaving behind a triumphant blonde bear who ignored his comment about her being a glutton. When he came back, the two happily enjoyed their dinner with Ayanna literally wolfing down her trouts while Harold was eating more slowly. When they were finished, the young man washed the dish before heading straight to the shower to get rid of the drool on him. When he returned in the living rooms later, he picked up his phone to call his mom while turning on the TV for both him and Ayanna. Their first night as responsible adults was pretty good after that. For the next few days, Harold and Ayanna stayed near their new home, but sometimes they would enjoy a little trip in the appealing forest around them. The area was simply wonderful and the river was full of fishes. When they wanted to relax, the two would just lay on the shores and listen to the sounds of nature. Harold would, from time to time, make good uses of the rods he found in his garage. His stock of fishes grew a bit thanks to this, and he had to make stocks almost every 3 days because of a certain bear. The day after they arrived in Forks, Harold, who remembered what his mother wrote on the letter he found, entered the first bedroom. The one he claimed as his before looking behind the large-sized bed. What he found had shocked him to the core, an old briefcase. Curious, he tried to open it but it didn't bulge. After a few more attempts, he almost gave up until he saw runes on it. Thanks to his family's teachings, Harold understood it perfectly. BLD is key. Reading this, the dark-haired young man had wondered its meaning before an idea passed through his mind. Using his power to change a nail into claws, he cut himself before letting a BLD drop falling on the runes. It instantly glowed in a soft bright light before a clicking sound was heard. Blinking a few times, Harold carefully reached forward to open the briefcase only to smile in triumph when it did. However, the smile quickly turned into shock by what he saw inside it. Money. Thousands of dollars. He gaped at the money as he couldn't believe that his great-grandfather would leave such a thing behind him. Noticing a note, he picked it up before reading it. At whoever took this home. My name is Sigurd Anderson, and if you are reading this, then you decided to live in my old home. If you are reading this, it also mean you have found my money. You might be wondering, why did I left $995,000 behind like that? Because I didn't cared about money. When I met the love of my life, she received a vision that a blessed one would appear in the future, so I leave some of my money behind. If you are the blessed one, then the money is yours. But if you are not, I suggest you do not try to touch it or it will be unpleasant. But if you truly are the one, then make good use of this money or else I will haunt you to oblivion. Sigurd Anderson. A bit intimidated by his ancestor's last words, Harold promised to respect his wishes and only took the money when necessary. His own account was far from little thanks to both his family and the few services he did to some people. But back to present, Harold was in the garage, cleaning the motorcycle his mother offered him. While he wanted nothing more than to use it, the dark brown-haired young man wanted to wait for a bit for that. Besides, it was fall-autumn, so he had to take extra care of Ayanna. Why? Because as a bear, she had to prepare herself for hibernation. And seeing that winter start in December, she had to eat a lot before it came. Harold had made some arrangements in her room. He installed runes to prevent sounds to reach her when activate. It will be pretty useful when winter will come. Ayanna had been kinda annoying after he told her about this because he had to take a shower after her demonstration of gratitude. Shivering a bit at the memory, Harold then looked back at his motorcycle, who was perfectly cleaned. With a relieved sigh, the dark brown-haired young man then wondered what he should do now. His house was clean, his stock of food will last a while. But then he thought about something. During one of his trips in the forest, he had caught the smell of wolves in the area. Harold hated wolves, not only because a pack had tried to eat him when he was a child, but because it reminded him of his time with the Potters thanks to a certain werewolf. I know what to do now, Harold muttered to himself as he left his domain. He wasn't worried about Ayanna as he knew she was around thanks to their bond, so he could leave her alone for a time. When he was hidden by the trees, the dark brown-haired young man shot a quick look around to make sure that no one was watching before changing into his full bear form. On his 4 legs, Harold stood 8 feet tall. His fur was dark brown like his hairs were, but the fur around his neck, which looked strangely like a small mane, was lighter in color. The massive bear then rushed forward to go near the river. Once there, he did what any bears would do in this situation, marking its territory. He started to rub trees with his back while being careful to not break them by accident. The massive werebear would also scratch the trees to leave behind some marks. He hoped that thanks to his smell and claw-mark size, wolves would avoid this part of the woods. For 2 hours, Harold marked some trees, and thanks to this, his territory now covered 2 miles around his house. Fork City was 3 miles away from his domain, if you want to know. Thank you, Mom, for your lessons, the massive bear growled to himself with satisfaction as he walked back to his home. However, as he approached his domain, he stopped dead in his tracks when a smell reached his nostrils. A growl soon escaped his throat. Why? Because the scent was similar to wolves but more powerful. Only 2 creatures could correspond to this, werewolves or wolf shifters. The massive bear reared on his hind legs to smell better and to detect where it came from. He stood no longer at 8 feet but on 16. Once he located the scent, Harold ran toward where it came from, determined to deal with whoever entered his newly claimed territory. It didn't take him long for him to reach the spot the scent came from, but he was greatly disappointed to see nothing. Smelling the air again, Harold grunted in slight anger because the owner of this scent had left not long before his arrival. Disappointed to not have the chance to tear down some canines, the massive bear grinned evilly as an idea passed through his mind. While he didn't have a chance to teach them a lesson, he could still announce his presence. Still grinning, Harold reared back on his hind legs before opening his jaws to release a powerful thunderous roar. His roar was heard from almost 3 miles away, and the animals who heard it either run away or cowed in fear. Not too far from the wooden house she resided in with her human, Ayanna was happily feasting on some mushrooms, but then interrupted her little meal when she heard a roar in the distance. She recognized it instantly as Harold's, and thanks to their bond, she understood its meaning. Get out of my territory. Despite being curious about who this warning was addressed, Ayanna shrugged her muscular shoulder before returning back to her mushrooms. She could always ask her human when he returns anyway. Meanwhile, 2 large horse-sized male wolves, who were walking in the forest not too far away from where Harold stood, suddenly froze dead on their tracks at the roar. The first wolf had short but thick brown fur but a bit of dark gray around his eyes. His name was Jared Cameron, and he was a wolf shifter like his companion and packmate Paul Lahote, whose wolf form had dark silver fur and with dark eyes. The 2 of them were patrolling their territory when they heard the most terrifying bestial roar ever. Their furs stood up instinctively as they understood that an apex predator had claimed the area as its home. What the hell is that? Paul telepathically asked his comrade with fear in this tone. His instinct was screaming at him to leave this place as fast as he could. It sounds like a bear, but it cannot be right. Jared replied back with a whimper. I don't know about you, but I would prefer to not stay here any longer. Paul said back while glancing at where the roar came from. You are right. Let's go find Sam. Jared nodded in agreement before the two dashed away, no wanting to deal with the owner of this roar. At the same time, unaware that his plan worked, Harold was making his way back to his home. Before leaving the cover of the trees, he returned back to his human form and with his clothes on before appearing in the clearing. Harold didn't have the time to sigh when a familiar blonde grizzly bear charged him, and he had even less time to react when Say Bear barreled into him, pining him under her large form. DMN at Ayana, what was that for? He grunted at her with narrowed eyes as he looked up at his familiar. For fun. The bear responded with a grin before giggling at the blank look he sent her way at this answer. What with the roar earlier? Ayana then asked him with a serious expression on her face. I caught the smell of wolves in the area, Harold responded with a little growl. The blonde grizzly bear nodded her large head in understanding but couldn't retain herself for saying with a bit of wonder. Isn't it a bit much? Not when it's either werewolves or shifters, Harold's answer caused her to freeze. She had heard of them from both her human and Astrid many years ago when the latter was teaching the former about their enemies. Ayana disliked wolves in general, but she didn't hated them contrary to her human, who she could understand where his own hatred came from. How many? The blind grizzly bear asked her with a growl. 2 at least, there might be more, we will have to be vigilant, but where there are present, Harold began to say before pausing while looking at his familiar with narrowed eyes. Vampires are not far. Ayana finished with a growl. Despite not having met them, Harold and his familiar both grew to dislike vampires greatly. From what Astrid said, vampires loved feeding on humans BLD and only a few would try to feast on animals. In history, werbears fought against those DMN leeches as Astrid called them, and at first, they met many defeats. But thanks to Callisto the Great Bear, who gave them a new form, his kind won against vampires. A treaty was written afterwards, and since then, the two species tend to avoid one another as best as possible. But that didn't stop them from hating one another. I will have to keep patrolling the forest until I had to go to school, Harold grumbled in determination to his familiar, who nodded in agreement. I might be able to fight off a werewolf, I would be defenseless against a shifter or a vampire, Ayana grumbled with a bit of shame. She had always hated being weak, and even her human knew it. You are the strongest bear I know, Aie, Harold whispered to her with a comforting smile. Ayana smiled at her human before licking his face in appreciation, much to his displeasure. Can't you stop licking me? The dark brown-haired young man inquired grumpily at his familiar while wiping the drool away from his face. Not my fault, you taste good, the blonde bear replied with a shrug, and he froze at those words. A laugh escaped Ayana's throat at the look on his face. Just kidding, silly. Harold took a second to recover from his shock as he growled playfully back at his familiar. Well then, if you want to play like this, let's see how you can survive a few days without fishes to feast on, the young man literally cooed mischievously to the blonde bear, who instantly stopped laughing once those words reached her ears. You wouldn't dare? She asked him with shock and worry. If a bear could pale, Ayana would. Try me, Harold cooed back with a mad grin on his face. Growling at him, the blonde bear was about to admit her defeat when a grin grew on her muzzle. Well then, you won't mind if I have you instead. As she said this, Ayana was using her massive body to pin him down as she opened her jaws right in front of his face before lowering it down. Wait, Harold began to cry in surprise before his entire head found itself in the she-bear's mouth. Ayana, because she was Harold's familiar, was slightly bigger than what a normal bear should be, so it was easy for her to fit his entire head inside. Speaking of the dark brown-haired young man, he had his face pressed against her warm tongue and covered again in her saliva. Thankfully his hands were still outside, so he used them to gently tap against his familiar's head. Alright, you win. Now open up. Harold inquired his familiar through telepathy, seeing that his face was smothered against Ayana's tongue. For a few seconds later, he was worried that she didn't hurt him, but then internally sighed in relief when the blonde bear reopened her mouth, but not without giving him another lick on the face. Harold groaned in pure disgust as he used his fingers to brush away from drools from his eyes and lips before glaring daggers at a smirking blonde bear. "I hate you, you know that," the dark brown-haired young man grumbled to Ayana, whose smirk grew a bit at those words. "No you don't," she cooed back to him before giving him a long lick on the face, earning a loud groan from him. Giggling, the blonde bear then went away, probably to the river to catch some fishes, leaving behind her human who didn't stop glaring at her. Once she was no longer in his sight, Harold sighed deeply as he went back on his feet before making his way to the bathroom. He really needed a bath. While he showed, his mind went back to the smell of wolves in the forest and a growl erupted from his throat. They best hope to never encounter him somewhere else. While Harold was taking a shower, in La Push, more precisely at the Quileute Indian Reservation, a discussion was taking place. Jared and Paul had returned a few moments ago to deliver their report about the mysterious predator that took residence in the forest a mile or two away from there. They had, of course, turned back in their human form to speak to their leader, who listened to their words with nothing but slight interest. But when they were finished, "This is troubling," a 6'6" tall man with long, rounded muscles commented in a deep voice as an expression of concern appeared on his older face. The guy had copper skin, cropped black hair and brown eyes. It was the leader of the pack, Sam Yulee. "What are we going to do?" Jared asked Sam with some worry. "I will speak with Billy about this, we will decide it afterwards," Sam replied to the two before leaving. He went toward a small wooden place with narrow windows whose dull red paint made it looking like a tiny barn. "Billy!" Sam called out loudly as he stood at the entrance. A few moments later, a man in a wheelchair appeared. The newcomer was heavyset with a deeply wrinkled face and dark russet skin with black eyes. It was Billy Black, an elder of the Quileute tribe who sadly didn't have the power to turn into a wolf like his son Jacob. "What is it, Sam?" Billy asked him with some concern. Jared and Paul just came back from their patrol and bring news. Billy's eyes narrowed at this as he asked with a bit of disgust, "About them?" Sam shook his head in response before opening his mouth to say, "No, from what they said it was something else." Billy's frown deepened and couldn't help but feeling some dread inside him. "Tell me everything." Sam nodded at the elder before relating what his fellow wolves said to him, the roar, how deep it sounded and how similar it was to a bear. When he finished, the shifter was a bit stunned to see Billy's face being completely pale as if he had seen a ghost. "Like a bear but bigger, you said," the wheelchaired man whispered with a bit of terror on his face. Sam, unable to say a word due to surprise, dumbly nodded his head. For a moment Billy looked deep in thought as sweats fell down his face. Could it be one of them? If that's the case, he thought to himself before looking back at Sam, who flinched a bit at the fierce look he was received. "You and the pack has to stay away from that part of the forest. If my suspicions are right, we better stay away from them," Billy ordered to the younger man with sternness. "Who? The bloodsuckers?" Sam asked him with a growl but also with a hint of curiosity. "No, Sam, something stronger." Billy's answer was soft, but he had heard it regardless. Sam stood there, waiting for the wheelchaired man to say more, but when nothing came out after a moment, he left the area to share the decision with the rest of the pack. Billy was so deep in thought that he didn't notice his departure as his mind went back to the Quileute's history, or more precisely on the shifter's history. Not the entire thing, mind you, but one part in particular. Images of large muscular bears fighting against shifters in their wolf forms passed through his mind, and he couldn't help but shiver a bit as a name formed in his head. Were bears. While his tribe had never actually fought against them, Billy knew without a doubt that it wouldn't matter at all. "Let's just hope I'm right and it is not one of them," the old man whispered to himself before re-entering his home. The best course of action was to wait and see if whatever it was is a threat to the tribe or not. He severely hoped that it would be the latter. Billy will not talk about this to anyone yet, not until this mysterious beast made itself known again. Elsewhere, Harold's domain. Unaware of what was going on, the dark brown-haired young man stepped out of the bathroom, fresh and clean of all bear drool. However, seeing that it was almost the end of the afternoon, Harold decided to take revenge on his familiar while she was away. With a mischievous grin, the dark brown-haired young man made its way toward his room while cackling like a mad scientist. Entering his bedroom, he searched through his stuff and soon pulled out something he had brought not long before leaving his mom. A fake poster featuring on it, "Bear Hunting Season." Cackling madly, Harold then climbed down the staircase to enter the kitchen where he decided to prepare some rainbow trouts and some honey. Why? As an apology gift for Ayanna after the prank. He couldn't wait to see her face. An hour or two later, the blonde grizzly bear came back from whatever she had been doing since she left him earlier. Harold, who was standing on the front door, made sure to have a look of pure horror on his face as he stared at the piece of paper in his hands. "Harold? What with the face?" Ayanna asked him with some concern as she approached him. Her human's blue-green eyes turned away from the paper to stare at her. "I found this after the shower. Someone had left it on the porch," Harold softly said to her with the same look of fear on his face. "What is it about?" The blonde bear asked in curiosity but with a feeling of worry inside her. "The start of bear hunting season," Harold replied somberly. Ayanna tensed at those words as her eyes widened in horror and fright. "What? Oh no, she began to cry in panic as she thought about being turned into a carpet. Harold managed to keep a straight face for a few seconds before laughing uncontrollably. Ayanna paused in her panic to stare at him with shock before it turned to anger. "It isn't funny. I might die, you idiot." She growled at him while internally being a bit sad that he seemed to find this amusing. "If it was actually bear hunting season maybe," Harold managed to say between two laughs. Ayanna froze at those words before asking in a deep tone. "It isn't?" "Of course not. You should have seen your face. Hilarious." Her mind went blank for a few seconds before the realization of what he did entered her mind. The blonde grizzly bear growled at her human when she realized he had pranked her. You pranked me?" She screamed at him in slight anger and irritation. "I did, and it was worth it," Harold replied with a joyful grin on his face. Ayanna, however, wasn't amused in the slightest as she turned her head away from him with a huff. "Aw, come on, Ai, don't take it like that. What about a peace offering?" The dark brown-haired young man inquired softly to his familiar glanced back at him at those words. "What peace offerings?" She might be angry and frustrated with her curiosity took over her mind. "Follow me to the kitchen, big girl," Harold gently cooed at her before re-entering the house. Ayanna stayed behind, thinking about either going there and being victim of another prank or staying behind to stay face. "Are you coming or not? It will get cold." Harold's voice echoed from the kitchen after a minute of debate. "What's getting cold?" she thought to herself as she made her way inside. When she entered the kitchen, the blonde bear was greeted by the sight of her human, standing in front of a large plate of trouts covered in honey. "I hope you enjoy it," Harold said to her with a smile. Ayanna stared at the delicious-looking fishes before looking back at her human. "You are forgiven for now," the blonde bear growled to him before digging in the offering meal. "As long as you don't stuff my head in your mouth again, you won't be pranked again," the dark brown-haired young man said back with a grin. "Deal." Ayanna replied to him before going back to her food under the amused eyes of her human who couldn't help but chuckle a bit at her gluttony. Besides, she needed it to be ready to hibernate. The following months were also pretty busy between patrols, feeding Ayanna and taking care of himself. On Christmas, he sent presents to his grandparents and mother, and later, Ayanna went to hibernation. The blonde bear had waited a bit to receive her own presents before going to sleep. Harold didn't told his mother and the rest of the family about the wolves as he hadn't smelled them after that day. He didn't know it, but his whole world will change after a very special meeting. January 17th. Well, Here we go, Harold grumbled as he climbed down his Harley-Davidson while looking at the building in front of him. He had left his wooden house pretty early to be sure to find the place at South Spartan Avenue. After all, the only times he actually left his domicile was to either take a trip in the forest or to buy some stuffs in the nearest supermarket. He didn't even went out to visit the place. Harold, like his parents and his ancestors, was not very fond of cities where lived too many people. In fact, he was starting to already hate his new school. The area had a frightening total of only 358 students. Even his old school wasn't as crowded. Right now, he wanted nothing more than to go back home and stay with Ayanna, but he couldn't. Education was important even if it was really annoying from time to time. Harold never liked schools mostly because of the people but not of the lessons themselves. Besides, his mother had enrolled him there, so, in her honor, he would go there. Leaving the house in the guard of Ayanna. Well, scratch that, the blonde bear was hibernating and he won't see her until spring. Leaving the house in the guard of his runes of protection, he left to head to school. However, it had took him an hour to find it as he didn't know its exact location. It was mostly his fault for going out really often, but hey, he thankfully had a strong memory, so it wasn't a total waste. To make things better, he got to use his Harley-Davidson for the second time. The first was to test it, and it was 2 months ago. He had asked his way at least 2 times before finding the high school. He had parked his motorcycle at his arrival and since then had been staring at the place, his hairs flying in the wind. Taking a deep breath, the dark brown-haired young man was about to enter this new place when he saw something in the corner of his eyes. Turning his head, he saw a young woman his age who was also looking at the school with hesitation. The young woman seemed to have a very pale complexion with long, straight, dark brown hair, a widow's peak, appealing chocolate brown eyes and a heart-shaped face along with a wide forehead. Speaking of her eyes, they were large and widely spaced. Her nose was thin and her cheekbones were prominent while her lips seemed too full for her slim jawline. Her eyebrows were darker than her hair and were straighter than they are arched. He didn't know why, but something inside him made him want to go there, and unconsciously he did. As he stepped closer, the dark brown-haired young man couldn't help but feeling more and more attracted by this unknown girl. She was even more appealing up close. Now that he was closer, he could tell that she was rather petite compared to him. She looked to be roughly around 5 feet 4 tall in height. However, he quickly broke his trance to focus on the main reason of his approach. Clearing his throat to catch her attention, Harold watched as she quickly turned her head to stare at him with those unique eyes of hers. But the second their eyes met, something unexpected happened. He felt like his soul was mixing with the girl in front of him as a sense of protectiveness passed through him. He didn't know what was going on as he had never felt something like this before. He had just met this girl and yet, he felt drawn to her. He will have to ask his mother later in the day. Realizing that he had been staring, Harold shook his head to regain his composure, but when he was about to speak, he saw that the girl looked to be in some sort of trance, her eyes staring at him or through him. Trying to break the awkward moment, the dark brown-haired young man cleared his throat again, which seemed to do the trick as herself shook her head to regain her senses. "Excuse me to bother you, but I noticed that you looked a bit lost there. Maybe I can help?" he inquired her respectfully and with a soft smile on his face. The unknown girl said back intelligently. Seeing that she looked a bit nervous, Harold gave her a soft smile which had the effect of reddening her face deeply. "Harold Anderson at your service, milady," the young man said with a small reverence. The girl blushed a bit more at the action, but he ignored it to ask her with some curiosity, "And you, fair lady?" "Be Bella Swan," the young woman responded back with a less visible blush on her face. "A pleasure to meet you, Miss Swan," Harold greeted her nicely and she smiled back at him, acting less shy now. "The pleasure is mine, Mr. Anderson." "Please just call me Harold. Mr. Anderson makes me feel old," the dark brown-haired young man inquired her with a tiny smile. "Only if you call me Bella," Bella inquired him back with a gentle smile. "Deal," he replied with a chuckle before asking. "Am I to assume that you are also a new student here?" "Yes, you." "I am," Harold responded with a sigh. "Oh, I had hoped you were already a student," Bella said in a soft, disappointed tone. But I'm not, at least we will have something in common, don't you think? Harold asked her with a smirk. Bella smirked back at him but nodded her head in agreement. Maybe we should go now, classes will start soon, the young woman said to her companion before rushing forward but not without grabbing him by the arm to drag him with her. Surprised by the action, Harold couldn't retain a small chuckle of amusement from escaping his throat as he let himself be carried away by someone much smaller than himself. However, he was still wondering why he acted like this toward this girl. Time skip. Harold and Bella, as they finished their first few classes, discovered pretty quickly that they were the centers of attention. As new students, transferred ones at that, the two of them were getting a lot of attention from the local students of the school. Each time they passed somewhere, whispers would follow them. Harold, thanks to his good hearing, could literally hear the comments of them, such as those ones. Look at this guy. He is so hot. Those muscles. The chick is absolutely appealing. DMN, the dude looks intimidating. Earlier, at the gym, Bella had accidentally hit someone with a volleyball. She had apologized and the guy, whose name was Mike, had tried to talk back to her but had quickly run away under Harold's gaze. Another young woman, a blonde, had tried to flirt with him but after a dangerous glare, she left him alone. There have been no more incidents after that. Shaking his head to get rid of those thoughts, the dark brown-haired young man made his way through the cafeteria toward one of the table which was strangely empty of people. Seating on the bench, Harold pulled out his lunchbox and a thermos. Why did he bring his own food, you may wonder? Easy, because school cafeterias are not known for their cuisines. Beside him, sat Bella Swan, who hadn't stopped being near him even in class. To his surprise, he had felt annoyed by her proximity like he should, and once again, wondered what was wrong with himself today. Ignoring the looks they were getting from the people, Harold opened his lunchbox to enjoy the food he prepared before coming to school. The smell instantly caught Bella's attention as she turned her head to look at him. What is it? It smells really good, the young woman said to him curiously. Thank you. I made this myself, do you want some? Harold asked her with a raised brow. She had yet to touch the food he offered because her chocolate brown eyes looked at his blue-green eyes. You still didn't answer the question. Now she was mischievous. Indeed I didn't, he chuckled in amusement before answering her question. It's trouts with garlic lemon butter herb sauce. Bella was now really curious and slowly cut a piece of his trouts before eating it just as slowly. Her eyes widened a bit as a smile grew on her face. This is delicious, she complimented him as her brown eyes, once again, locked on his blue-green ones. I'm glad you liked it, Sakna, Harold replied back to her with a smile before enjoying his meal. Sakna? What does this mean? Bella asked him with a frown, not understanding the language he used. Oh, I'm sorry, Bella, slip of the tongue, and to answer you, it mean, miss, in the tongue of my people, the dark brown-haired young man answered her when he realized what he said. Your people? Bella asked him curiously. Long story, Harold replied with a shrug while internally cursing himself for almost spilling the existence of werbears. You will not tell me more, am I right? The young woman asked him with narrowed eyes. No, he replied back with a playful grin. Pouting at him, she decided to go back on his food and he chuckled a bit in amusement before doing the same. But then he tensed when a strange smell reached his nose and he turned his head toward another table where a group of people had gathered there. They looked normal but their scent was not. There were 5 of them in total. The first one was a petite girl with black pixie-cut hair. The second was a lean but muscular guy with honey blonde hair. The third one was a guy who had the same size that Harold's 6'5" and looked burly and very muscular. He also had slightly curly, dark brown hair that almost looks black in color. He looked to be the tallest of the 5. The 4th person was a gorgeous woman with a figure similar to a model. Standing at 5'9", she had long wavy blonde hair that fell halfway down to the middle of her back. She was simply stunning but not enough to be compared to Bella in his opinion. The last one was also a guy, and if he was honest, Harold would say that the guy was more good-looking than him. His facial features were perfect with angular high cheekbones, a strong jawline, perfect eyebrows, a straight nose and full lips. His untidy hair had an unusual bronze shade. He was standing at 6 feet 2. While they looked different from each other, all of them shared the exact same feature, their eyes. They were all golden in color. Another thing they all shared were their pale skins. Harold's mind froze as he realized what they were, vampires. A small growl slowly rose from his throat, but then he frowned in confusion. Aren't vampires supposed to have red eyes? Thinking for a moment, he shrugged as he finally made a decision. He would just ask his mother later. He was about to focus back on his meal when he noticed something. One of the male vampires had his eyes on Bella. Seeing this, his instinct went almost berserk, but he managed to keep his cool to avoid creating troubles on his very first day. However, that didn't stop him from sending a dangerous glare toward the vampire whose eyes looked away from the young woman to stare at him with narrowed eyes. Quickly glancing at Bella to be sure she wasn't looking, the dark brown-haired young man made gesture signifying, "I got my eyes on you." The vampire's golden eyes narrowed at him, but after an harsh glare from Harold, he looked away. Huffing silently in satisfaction, the young man went back to his meal. A small silence followed until Bella broke it. "You're not very talkative, are you?" "Not really, I'm usually left alone so," Harold replied with a shrug. "Why that?" Bella asked him with a hint of curiosity in her voice. "Sort of habit and maybe because I like being alone," the dark brown-haired young man responded in a soft tone while looking at her sideways. "So am I bothering you?" Bella asked him with a hint of hurt in her voice. Hearing this, Harold froze before looking at her in alarm. "No, no, 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 of course not. You are most welcome here." A smile appeared on her heart-shaped face and he couldn't help but smiling back. He still didn't understand why he was so drawn to this girl, but it wasn't so bad. Realizing they had been staring at one another's eyes, he coughed in his fist, blushing a bit as he said those words. "Well, let's just finish our stuff before going to the next class." "Of course. Biology, right?" Bella asked him with a blush of her own. The two soon went back to their meal, and once they finished, the two went together to their next class. However, on the way there, Harold froze when he saw the same vampire than before, but then narrowed his eyes as he kept walking. Passing inches away from the guy, he had to retain himself from throwing up at the vampire's scent, but he managed to say with clenched teeth, "Don't try anything, vampire, or I will end you." The guy in question seemed shocked by those words, but Harold didn't stay to see more as he entered the classroom alongside Bella. Speaking of the young woman, she had noticed the vampire, and while she found him pretty good looking, she couldn't help but seeing Harold as a better guy. As she sat behind him, Bella couldn't help but thinking about their earlier meeting and the strange sensation she felt when their eyes connected. A blush slowly formed on her face as she remembered this strange need to being near him. Bella had never felt so drawn towards someone, and while she found it strange, she didn't mind as Harold seemed to be a good guy, albeit a bit lonely. He admitted it after all, so she promised to herself to be there for him. And she will keep this promise. Back to Harold, unaware of what Bella was thinking, she was glaring sideways at the vampire guy who unfortunately was sitting next to him, whose eyes were narrowed at him back defiantly. A few seconds later, the dark brown-haired young man felt like someone was trying to enter his head and instantly close his mind. "Thank you, Einar, for those lessons," he thought to himself as he watched in satisfaction the vampire being confused by something. A few years ago, Astrid had taught her son about vampires and their abilities. Some could read mind, others could cause pain to others without moving, and Einar taught him how to oppose those type of attacks. Over the years, he developed a strong barrier around his mind to protect it thanks to the meditation. And it seemed that they were strong enough to repel that DMN leech. Grunting in satisfaction, Harold's attention went back on the front where the teacher was starting the lesson. However, he didn't saw Bella's questioning face looking at his back and was unaware that she had seen the entire thing. Time skip. "Classes today were interesting," Harold commented as he and Bella both appeared in the parking. The two of them hadn't been seen without the other present, or at least close by. Harold's muscles had intimidated some of the boys who seemed to be interested by Bella. He couldn't blame them, but for some reason, he felt a bit protective of her. He cannot wait to go home and call his mother for some informations. Apart of that, nothing spectacular happened so far if you didn't count the hateful glares he received from the guy he menaced earlier. He learned that they were the Cullens and the adoptive children of the Dr. Carlisle Cullen and his wife Esme. He quickly learned who was who so he wouldn't get confused. The petite pixie-like girl was Alice Cullen, the lean but muscular guy with honey blonde hair was Jasper Hale, the tall muscular guy with curly brown hair was Emmett Cullen, the gorgeous blonde was Rosalie Hale, and finally the one who hadn't stopped glaring at him was Edward Cullen. From what he managed to gather, the Cullens had moved here from Alaska a few years ago. Harold was horrified by the presence of those bloodsuckers around so many humans, but for some reasons, they didn't seem to mind being around food. In fact, they had acted like normal people for the entire day. He will definitely call his mother to at least warn her about this. Back to present, the two friends stopped not too far from their vehicles. Bella smiled up at him and he smiled back. "See you tomorrow, Hasakna Swan," the dark brown-haired young man inquired to her with a grin. "Again with your Mr. Anderson?" Bella retorted back with a grin, and she giggled when he started groaning in annoyance at the use of the word Mr. "So this is your vehicle?" Harold asked her with curiosity when his blue-green eyes landed on the 50s-60s faded red-orange truck. After close investigation, he quickly recognized it as a 1963 Chevy stepside seat 10 pickup. "A beauty." "Yeah, a gift from my dad," Bella responded with a chuckle. "He sure know how to choose things," the dark brown-haired guy commented as he eyed one again, the pickup. "Is that a motorcycle?" Bella asked him back as she pointed at his own vehicle with a finger. "Aye. But not just a motorcycle, a Harley Davidson." Harold replied back with a proud look on his face. "A gift from your parents, or you brought it yourself?" Bella asked him with an amused raised brow. "Boys with their toys." "Aye. From my mirror I never met my dad," Harold replied back with a sad tone. "Sorry about your father," Bella whispered to him while giving him an apologetic look. "It's fine," he whispered back with a shrug while being touched by her care. After a moment of silence, the young woman was the one to speak as she opened her mouth to say, "Can I give you my number?" Blinking at the sudden request, he stared at her with surprise, wondering how to respond. A little voice in his head was screaming at him to say, yes, and seeing the look in her eyes he sighed. "Sure," Harold responded with a little blush as he rubbed the back of his head with embarrassment. A small squeal escaped her mouth, but she quickly stopped to pull out her phone. They exchanged their numbers so they could stay in contact before they both climbed on their own engines. After any last wave of goodbye, they drove away to their respective home. At the same time, a group of people were having a heated discussion. They were all in a large, graceful house, rectangular and well-proportioned, painted a faded white. The southern wall of this house was almost entirely made of glass, with a view of the Kalawa River. The people in question were none other than the Cullen family: Alice, Rosalie, Jasper, Emmett, Edward, and their adoptive parents Carlisle and Esme Cullen. Edward was the one to start as he told his family what had happened today. The new students. The fact he couldn't read their minds. The muscular guy who blocked his attempt to see his thoughts. The same guy who somehow knew what he was and menaced him. Alice had commented once that the guy's name was pretty exotic and charming, but was mostly ignored as they listened to Edward's report. When he finished, they all stayed silent as their mind processed what they just heard. "What are we gonna do?" Alice asked softly as she looked at everyone present. "We must keep an eye on him," Jasper said with a serious expression on his face. Rosalie, had a different idea in mind. "I saw the guy and he is kinda attractive." Emmett stared at her in fake betrayal, which caused some of them to laugh with humor at the couple's antics. It was no secret that Rosalie loved to tease her husband from time to time. "Edward, are you sure there isn't more about this, Harold Anderson?" Esme asked him with some concern along with curiosity. The most handsome vampire of the group went deep in thought for a second before answering. His smell was strange. What about it? Rosalie asked him with a raised brow. When I smelt it, something inside me was telling me to run away from him, Edward explained to them with a bit of confusion on his face. It was also similar to those mutts but stronger, and when I looked into his eyes it was as if I was looking at an apex predator, he added after another second of thoughts. Carlyle, who had listening calmly to the whole thing, suddenly tensed on his chair, an action noticed by everyone. Carlyle? Esme called out in concern to her husband. If a vampire could pale, the head of the Cullen family would be as pale as a ghost. The scent, was it like that of a bear? Carlyle asked his son with an alarmed look on his face. Emmett tensed at the word bear, and Rosalie instantly went to comfort him. Before being turned into a vampire, he had been attacked by a bear and it left some sequels. Rosalie was the one who saved him before carrying him to Carlyle. Now that you mention it, yes, it was stronger, but yes, it was similar. YDO- Edward answered with confusion before pausing when Carlyle went back on his feet with a look of panic on his face. DMNIT, he cursed loudly, which caused everyone around him to look at him with surprise and shock. Carlyle Cullen never cursed. And when he does, which was really rare, his curses are old and archaic. One of them had to be here of all place. Carlyle literally hissed with panic as he paced around the room. Carlyle! Esme called out loudly, which had the effect to catch his attention and stopping him in his track. Calm down, his wife inquired him in a gentle tone, and he did just that. Once he was a bit more relaxed, Carlyle looked back at his children before saying, I'm sorry you had to see that. They all nodded their heads, accepting the apology but still curious of why he acted like this. Can you now tell us what was that all about? Edward asked him with narrowed eyes. Carlyle looked at the rest of his family, who all looked back at him waiting for an explanation. With a sigh and a quick look at the soft smile of Esme, the head of the family faced them again to answer. Have you all ever heard of werbears? He asked them with a serious expression on his face. They all blinked in confusion, staring at one another with frowns on their faces. Werbears? Alice asked him with a voice filled with curiosity as her eyes seemed to shine in interest. What are werbears, Carlyle? Esme, his wife, asked him with equal curiosity. Werbears are people who can turn into massive bears. They are a lot stronger than the wolves but more dangerous. No one knows where they come from, but many centuries ago, when our kind started to come to America, they had to face them, Carlyle explained in a serious tone before pausing in his story. Emmett looked fearful at the mention of bears but himself was curious of this new kind. Rosalie had her eyes narrowed while Jasper looked fully interested, just like Alice. Esme herself seemed mesmerized by the tale but didn't ask any questions. Who won? Edward asked his adoptive father with a hint of interest in his voice. At first, it was us vampires because we were faster, but then it all changed in the end. We lost many of our kind in this battle to be sure that no other vampires lost its life. We made a peace treaty with them, Carlyle answered to his son while shivering a bit from the inside. He wasn't a part of this battle, but he had heard from elder vampires how destructive it had been for their kind. Why are telling us about them? Jasper asked him with a frown. Alice and Rosalie thought the same before their eyes widened when they realized it. Are you thinking Dash? The former began to ask in a soft tone but was interrupted by her father. Yes, this Harold Anderson is possibly a werbear. Carlyle replied with a sharp nod. A shocked silence followed as they looked at one another. What are we going to do about him? Emmett finally asked. A moment of dead silence. They all turned their heads to look at Carlyle. Nothing for now. And Edward? You said he was with a girl. Yes, they seemed pretty close. I tried to read her mind but I couldn't. The handsome vampire responded to his adoptive father with a pensive look. He seemed to be really protective of her, Alice said from her seat before adding. Each time a boy tried to approach her, he would scare them with a glare. It was kinda cute. Carlyle groaned audibly, but not because of Alice's words, but about something else. All right children, try to not provoke him. I do not want to deal with a furious werbear, even a young one. he ordered them with a stern expression on his face, and they quickly nodded. "What about the girl?" Jasper asked from his seat. "If she is close to the young man, then I suggest we leave them both be. As I said, I do not want to deal with an enraged werebear." Carlyle responded after a few seconds of thoughts. They all nodded one again and were about to leave when Rosalie asked loudly, "What about the wolves? Aren't you afraid that he would ally with them?" "Not really. The shifters and the werebears are rivals from what I heard, and they dislike each other deeply," Carlyle responded with a shrug. They all nodded their heads, silently promising to not create a conflict with this new creature. However, Edward had different thoughts as images of Bella passed through his mind again and again. Elsewhere. "Hello, Mom," Harold said warmly with a phone against his ear. He had returned from school a moment ago, and after parking the motorcycle in the garage, the young man went to the phone to call Astrid. Ayanna was sleeping soundly upstairs, and thanks to the tunes he installed in her room, she couldn't hear him, so he could speak as loudly as he could. "My baby boy. How was your first day?" Astrid's delighted greeting responded through the device. "Interesting so far, but, by the Great Bear, this school is crowded," the dark brown-haired young man said to his mother, who giggled a bit in amusement. "Of course it is. It is not Montana, you know." "Yeah, Mom, I have some things to tell you," Harold said with a hint of nervousness. "What things?" she asked him with some concern clear in her tone. "There are vampires here in Forks," he revealed to her in a dark tone. A growl was heard from the device. "Are you sure? How many of them?" Her tone was filled with sternness and slight disgust. "Affirmative. Pale skins, smells like death, and apparently 7 of them. But Mom, aren't vampires supposed to have red eyes?" Harold inquired her gently. Astrid, who was growling deeply, stopped at his question. "Yes, why?" "Because they all had golden eyes," he answered bluntly. "I never heard of a vampire with gold eyes. I will contact my uncle Einar, maybe he will know." Harold nodded his head. Einar was really old and was a shaman, so he tended to travel a lot. Maybe he encountered strange things during one of his trips. But then his mind went back to another topic. "There is more, Mom." "What?" she asked him with concern and worry clear in her tone. "I met a girl today. I went to help her, but then when he looked at one another in the eyes, I felt like my whole world was becoming brighter and fuller." Harold explained to his mother, who stayed silent for a moment. "Mom," he called out in concern at the lack of answers. But then he hissed in pain when a loud squeal of happiness escaped the phone. "I can believe it, you found your one." "My one?" he asked her dumbly, in his a frown of confusion. "Oh, I forgot to teach you that, didn't I?" she asked softly in a sheepish tone. "Maybe, but why? I have a feeling that it was a bit intentional." Harold inquired with a knowing tone. "I do not know what you are talking about, dear. My dear son, in short, you have found your soulmate." Astrid casually replied through the phone, and his eyes widened at those words. "What? How? Why?" he asked rapidly in disbelief. "I don't know, it just happened. Me and Leaf were soulmates, so I know what it is like." "What should I do?" "What is the girl's name?" "Bella Swan." "Appealing name. Well, the best action is to reveal it to her in due time. Try to get to know her first before revealing it, though." "I will," Harold responded with a tone filled with determination. "Good, because the next time I see you, I hope to meet her as well." Her next words caused him to gap in shock. "What? Why?" "My to visit my future stepdaughter, of course." Astrid responded cheerfully. He stared blankly at the phone in his hands. "Aren't you a bit too excited about this?" "Of course. I still need to speak with her after all." Gulping slightly at the devilish tone she just used, he then cleared his throat to say, "Very well, I will try to tell her, but I can't make any promises." "Attaboy. Now tell me, how was classes?" Astrid inquired him with interest. For the next few minutes, Harold spoke with his mom, unaware that people were talking about him or thinking about him. As the time passed, Harold's relationship with Bella grew a bit more. They were always seen together, and because of this, rumors that they were involved with one another spread through the high school. The few people who tried to ask them were either turned on or scared by Harold's glares. Speaking of the dark brown-haired young man with blue-green eyes, he had been constantly on his guard when he was not at home. Why? Because of the vampires, but more on the one named Edward Cullen. The days following his and Bella's arrival at the school, the handsome vampire had constantly looked at Bella as if she was a piece of meat. Of course, Harold would glare at him dangerously, but it did little to the vampire, who sometimes answered him with a sneer. The other vampires, much to his relief, hadn't said anything, and the pixie-like girl Alice even whacked him on the head when she caught Edward glaring at him or staring at Bella. The other girl, Rosalie, sometimes shot him glances, but not of anger like Edward, but more like disgust. It had shocked him at first, but now his only response to this was glaring at her as well. The guy who was as tall as him, Emmett, would sometimes look at him in fear. Harold was a bit surprised when he noticed this in a vampire's eyes, but brushed it aside as none of his business. Maybe the guy met a werbear and got defeated? It was possible. Jasper, him, was the civil one. Every morning, when their eyes locked on one another, the blonde vampire would nod at him respectfully, which he returned. He might not like vampires, but he would at least be civic. Later many other things happened. Einar, his granduncle, revealed to him by phone that the vampires he saw weren't like others. The eyes of a vampire determined its diet, red for human BLD and golden or yellow for animal BLD. It had been a shock to hear that vampires would not drink human BLD, and apparently his mother had been as shocked at him. However, despite those revelations, he doesn't plan to befriend them anytime soon. Speaking of friends, Bella reacquainted with her childhood friend, Jacob Black, who he had met days after his first day at school. Jacob was a 5'10" tall young man with long, glossy black hair pulled back by a RBB band at the nape of his neck. His skin looked silky and russet-colored, and his eyes were dark, set deep above the high planes of his cheekbones. In addition, he had a hint of childish roundness left around his chin. The guy had been pretty suspicious about him, and Harold himself had been a bit tense around the other man, but then the two discovered that they shared something in common: their loves for engines. Jacob had instantly complimented his Harley Davidson, but Harold knew that it was mostly to be polite and maybe to please Bella. However, they were slowly growing out of their distrust as they talked more and more. Of course, he still looked a bit unsure around Jacob, but he was getting around. Bella, had been overjoyed to see the two of them getting along, but not to the point of being called friends. Speaking of the Swan girl. Ever since she met Harold, she had been wondering why she found him as the most handsome man at school. Something inside her wanted her to stay close to him and his toned body. And she did. She and him became the main subject of discussion at school, and she was well aware of the rumors about them being a couple. Bella Swan might be many things, but stupid was not one of them. Another thing she had noticed was how this boy, Edward Cullen, looked at her or at Harold. Since her first day at school, she had detected the animosity between the two young men and had yet to discover what was going on. Of course she had asked Harold about it, but he would shrug and said the same words again and again. It's nothing really, guys, stuffs. But she knew better. Edward clearly looked interested in her or obsessed by her, and Harold seemed protective of her, which for some reason warmed her heart. In her head, at first, she could see only one explanation: the two were rivals for her affection. But it was absurd. Harold never tried once to flirt with her like some other boys do, at least when they managed to get past him and his glares. A small voice in her head was telling her that being the muscular dark brown-haired boy's girlfriend doesn't sounded so bad, and her heart would tell her the same. Edward Cullen was handsome, even her could admit it, but she didn't felt attracted to him like she did to Harold. But as the time passed, she had noticed something else. Harold, who became a good friend to her, had been looking at the other Cullens with suspicions and a bit of hatred. Sure, they were good-looking and all, but a part of that, they looked normal, albeit paler and with unusual golden eyes. Golden or yellow eyes were not very seen around the world. Bella instantly tried to find more about them, and even now she had nothing. Harold had helped her a bit by pointing her at a section of the library, about fantastic creatures. When she asked him why he would point such a book, the young man had responded, and I quote, "You might have a slight idea of what they are." Bella, of course, went through the book, and one chapter in particular caught her attention, one about vampires. The young woman had frowned as vampires' description matched with the Cullens, but thought that it was just a coincidence. After all, vampires aren't real, right? Sure, they had pale skins, looked more good-looking than the other people, and had strange eyes, but there was no way in hell they were freaking vampires. For the following days, she stopped her research until an incident that caused to start looking again. The chocolate-eyed young woman then remembered when she and Harold were almost struck by a van. The two were leaving school, and it was thanks to Harold that she was still alive. Bella remembered how he had pushed her behind him, putting himself between her and the van, stopping it with his bare hands. She remembered the amazement at seeing the young man she became friend with holding his ground against a van. Worse, the front part of the vehicle had almost been destroyed. She knew he was strong, but not that strong. She wasn't the only one who had been surprised by this. The Cullens had been watched the scene with wide eyes, except Edward, who seemed angry about something. Harold, thankfully, hadn't been injured except for the little pieces of glass that pierced his skin at the collision. He had been brung to the infirmary, where the nurses carefully pulled them out. Bella had been there the whole time. After this incident, she became even more determined to find answers about not only the Cullens but also Harold. While she was thankful for him for saving her life, she was still wondering how it was possible for a young man to perform such a feat. She had tried to ask him personally, but he always evaded the subject, and when she thanked him for this, his answer had surprised her. "I did what others would have done in my place. Beside, I like you and I do not want to see you get hurt." Her heart had warmed even more at those words. Jacob, when he heard the news, had been concerned for her and had thanked Harold for saving his best friend, and he had only nodded back with a tiny smile. Later, Jacob warned both her and Harold, but our hero knew it was mostly to warn the girl that the Cullens cannot be trusted. When asked why, the 5'10" tall young man explained that there was a strong animosity between the Quilutes and the Cullens, and because of this, they were not allowed on the reservation. That brings us back to present in February, to be precise. It was Sunday and the air was still a bit cold because of the fact it was still winter. We could hear nothing but silence in the air, as many of the animals were either hibernating or hiding from the snow. But the silence was soon interrupted by two people. There were none other than Bella Swan and her father, the sheriff Charlie Swan. The former wanted to visit Harold, and the latter wanted to meet the young man his daughter hadn't stopped talking about for some time. The man had a strong suspicion that his daughter was in love with the young man. Charlie Swan had a mustache and curly brown hair, chocolate brown eyes that Bella inherited. He stood about 6 feet tall and had an average build. He was currently wearing regular jeans and shirts. "Are you sure he lives here, Charlie?" the young woman impatiently asked her father as she looked around. "I'm pretty sure he does. I read his files," Charlie responded to her with a frown. They were pretty far away from the town after all. As they walked, the two couldn't help but admire the area. It was simply appealing, and the snow and ice seemed to sparkle under the light of the sun. Bella herself gazed around with a bit of amazement. She could understand why her friend would choose such a place as his home. They walked for another 2 minutes, but then stopped when a strange sound echoed in the air. Chunk. The sound came from nearby, and it was as if someone was chopping woods. Curious, father and daughter glanced at one another before stepping closer. Soon they found themselves entering a clearing where stood a large wooden house. But it was not what had caught their eyes. Chunk. There, standing a few feet away from them, was Harold, and he was chopping woods. The young man was shirtless and sweating profusely. Bella couldn't retain herself from blushing a bit as she stared at the muscles of his chest. But then her chocolate eyes landed on something in his hands, an axe. But the weapon itself was gorgeous to look at. It had a wooden haft with a silver-colored textured grip. The grip itself had a wrapped texture, and there was an engraved design at the bottom of the haft. Next, its head had an ornate design. The socket and side panels on the haft possessed geometric patterns. In the center of the socket, there was a blue gem. On the bearded blade, Bella could see a strange drawing that looked like a bare head. Chunk. Her trance was broken as the axe fell down, cutting the piece of wood in half. Charlie, for his part, was staring at the young man with narrowed eyes. This boy was tall for someone his age and pretty muscular. His long dark brown hair was wet attached into a ponytail, possibly to prevent it from disturbing him in his work. Despite knowing that the guy before him was only 17, he was still a bit surprised to see him having the beard of a 19-year-old man. Clearing his throat, the young man stopped his work before slowly turning around to face them. "Oh, sorry, I didn't hear you coming, hee." Harold greeted them while rubbing the back of his head with embarrassment. In truth, he had heard them, but to appear more normal, he had to play the part. "It's fine, Harold. Your house is appealing," Bella complimented with a smile while still harboring a blush of her face. "Thank you, Sakna Swan," the dark brown-haired young man responded with a tiny smirk on his face. Charlie blinked at the strange word, but before he could ask about it, someone beat him to it. "Again with this, Mr. Anderson?" Bella retorted back with a playful grin, knowing that he was doing this on purpose. "I enjoy this little game of ours," Harold replied with a chuckle as she pouted at him before looking at the older man near his friend. "You must be Bella's father." "Charlie, right?" He sounded nervous as he asked this. "Indeed, Sheriff Swan, at your service, Mr. Anderson," the mustached man said to the younger one with a friendly expression on his face. After seeing their little interaction, Charlie's suspicions about the two grew a bit, but seeing how friendly this Harold Anderson was, he decided to act the same. "Welcome to my domain. Maybe you might want to get inside. It's freezing out there after all," he added with a small smile. Father and daughter nodded as they followed their host when the latter led them inside with his axe in hand. When he let them in, Charlie and Bella looked around in amazement as the interior was pretty cozy. "Make yourself comfortable in the living room, I have to take a quick shower," Harold explained to them while pointing at his sweat-covered chest. They both nodded their heads before watching as their host made his way upstairs. Charlie and Bella shared one glance before heading to the living room, and both had to admit that the sofa was really comfortable. "This place is homey," the young woman commented as she looked at the area, taking in every detail of the place she was in. "It is this young man sure know how to take care of his house, however. I wonder where are his parents," Charlie said casually as he enjoyed the softness of the sofa. "He only had a mother. He told me that he never met his dad," Bella responded to her father while looking at one of the portraits where we could see a younger Harold and a gorgeous woman with light brown hair and dark green eyes. "It must be his mom," she thought in realization as the way the two were holding one another. Charlie looked sad at the fact the young man never got to meet his father, but still, where was the mother? "What do you think of him, Charlie?" Bella suddenly asked him with a hint of curiosity in her tone. "He seems to be a decent bloke, but I will wait to know him a bit more before judging," the mustached man replied to his daughter, who only nodded her head in understanding. A few moments later, Harold came back in a new set of clothes and without his axe. "So tea or coffee?" he asked his guests with a smile when he reappeared in the living room. Time skip. It had been almost an hour since the arrival of Bella and her father, and so far, things went smoothly. After drinking their coffees, Charlie had, of course, asked some questions, and the dark brown-haired young man answered them as best as he could. In fact, it's simple questions such as, where did he live before coming to Forks? Where was his mother? What was his favorite hobby, i.e.s. etc. The first questions were a bit difficult to answer as the young man still missed Montana, and Charlie had been pretty shocked to hear that it was tradition for people his age to leave their parents to become independent. The question about hobbies had been pretty easy to answer: baking, cooking, napping, eating, driving his Harley Davidson. So far, Charlie seemed to like him, which was good because Harold would be sad to be separate from his soulmate who still didn't know about it. Bella's eyes shined as she looked at the interaction between her friend and her father. Internally, she had been worried that Charlie would ask her to stop seeing him. She didn't know why, but she couldn't see herself being away from his young man, or at least for too long. But then, she thought about something: her suspicions about him and the Cullens. So far, Harold seemed to answer Charlie's question as trustfully as he could. Maybe she could use this to her advantage. Hiding a smirk, the young woman loudly cleared her throat to catch their attention of the other. They didn't heart it, however. Harold? Bella called out softly, interrupted the two men in their discussion. Yes, Sakna Swan? Harold asked back with a teasing smirk. Her eyebrow twitched again at the word, but she ignored it in favor of asking him with a hint of impatience. You talked a lot of time about your people and your tradition. Can you tell us me more about it? She asked him innocently. Harold shot her a blank look as he clearly see where she was going with it, but shrugged. Beside, her father looked kind of curious now, so it was not a good idea to lie now. All right, but you must promise to not say this to anyone. Harold asked them with narrowed eyes. Charlie and Bella blinked in shock at the sudden change of behavior but nodded their heads regardless. My ancestors came from Norway, Northmen and women, he began to say with a hint of sadness before going on. People who tried to establish in Europe after their banishment, and for a time, they lived in peace until the Church and the Inquisition. The young man carefully explained to his guests while hiding some facts such as him and his ancestors being warbears. Many of us had to flee for their lives because everyone saw us as heretics, Harold added with venom as he thought of priests or fanatic members of the church. Bella seemed horrified by the tale while Charlie looked disturbed. What happened next? The young woman asked him in a soft tone. They left Europe, as you can imagine, for weeks. They traversed the Atlantic before arriving on Newfoundland's shores, but not all of them managed to land safely. Charlie looked a bit pained at that part and shot a look of sympathy to the young man before him. Harold shot him a grateful look before blinking when he felt arms around his neck. It was Bella shooting him a small smile. The young man went on his story. Those who survived managed to build a new home, but later, they got into conflicts with some of the locals when the village started to be crowded. However, after a treaty, my people and the Amerindians coexisted peacefully. Harold then sighed deeply when he finished speaking, but then turned his head toward his two guests. Even if my people left their home, we have kept some of our original traditions such as the languages, the writing of runes and some rituals. So you speak Norwegian? Charlie asked him as if it was logical. No, the Old Norse, the language of Vikings. Harold replied proudly. Bella and Charlie were stunned by those revelations. No way. I thought the Vikings disappeared, the former said with shock. The traditions died, yes, but not the people. And my people, unlike the actual Northmen and women, hadn't left our traditions behind. Harold responded with a shrug. So you still believe in Norse gods? Charlie asked him with disbelief. Not exactly, but we still believe in something that is not Christian, the young man answered back casually. Which is? Bella asked him defiantly but also curiously. She couldn't believe that she was friend with a living Viking. But that explained the axe from earlier and the strange drawings on some part of the house. I can't tell you, I'm sorry, Harold responded in a soft tone but a look of slight sadness. I see, family business? Charlie asked him with a raised brow. Something like that, yes, Harold replied with a nod. Bella, for her part, was a bit disappointed by this but could understand it as she was not Harold's family. Not yet, a small voice whispered in her head which caused her to blush a bit. Charlie, however, noticed it and raised an eyebrow at his daughter's behavior. His father instinct kicked in and he looked sharply at the young man before him, who looked stunned by his sudden stare. Mr. Anderson, as a father, it is my duty to ask you this: do you like my daughter? Charlie. Bella cried out to her father with a mad blush on her face. Harold, too, was blushing, but he quickly regained his composure to answer the young woman's father. This was his moment. It was risky, but if it worked he would be one happy man. Mr. Swan, I will be honest with you, your daughter is an amazing person. She is fun, fierce, determined, appealing and caring. Despite being a loner, I grew to love her company. After all, who wouldn't? She became someone I cared dearly. Bella looked stunned by his declaration as her face turned even redder. Charlie, was impassive, but in his eyes, it was easy to see that he seemed to appreciate this young man's compliment toward his daughter. So yes, Mr. Anderson, I like your daughter. No, I love your daughter and I would be happy if she accepted to be my girlfriend, he began to say to Charlie before turning his head toward the mustached man's daughter at the last words. Once again, Bella was stunned as she looked at him with wide eyes. She hadn't seen this coming, however, her mind and heart were screaming to say, yes. So she did. Yes. Harold looked happy by her answer and the young woman practically lunged at him to embrace him. Carefully wrapping his arms around her, the dark-haired young man returned the gesture before they both froze when they remembered that they weren't alone. Charlie looked at the two of them with narrowed eyes and they quickly pulled away from one another, blushing. You have some guts to make the demand in front of me, Mr. Anderson, the mustached sheriff began to say in a stern tone that somehow worried the two. But then, they both blinked in surprise when Charlie laughed loudly. It was simply unexpected. And because of this, you got my approval. Bella's father added with a chuckle as he saw the relief on the younger man's face. However, hurt my daughter and I will hurt you, Charlie menaced him with a glare that could melt ice, but Harold merely nodded. His grandmother's glares were more terrifying, heck, even his mom's were scarier than Charlie's. I will never do such things, don't worry about it, Mr. SWA-, Harold began to say but was interrupted by the mustached man. Please call me Charlie. Only if you call me by my name. Deal. They firmly shook their hands under the pleased chocolate eyes of Bella. She had never thought having a boyfriend before, but now she didn't mind it one bit. Her heart seemed fine with having Harold the hot Viking boy as her boyfriend. A blush appeared on her face. Where does this came from? Shaking her head, her chocolate eyes returned back to the two men before her who were laughing about something Charlie just said. Internally, she was overjoyed that her father seemed to approve of Harold despite just having met the man, but she wasn't complaining. She was also amazed by the bravery Harold showed by asking such a question right in front of Charlie. No boys would do such things. And he just did. A warm smile grew on her face at the words he said about her and her heart melted a bit more because of it. That, and she had seen the expression in his blue-green eyes when those words left his eyes, love. Shaking her head, Bella Swan focused back on present just when Harold said that he invited the two of them to stay for dinner. Charlie had protested at first, saying that he didn't wanted them to intrude, but Harold was having none of it. In the end, Charlie accepted with a bit of reluctance. However, there was still time before dinner time, so the young man showed them around as they passed near a closed room the one Ayanna was hibernating in. Harold said that it was a private place, so it was forbidden to enter. Bella had been curious about it but would respect his wish. The rest of the day passed quickly and the diner he prepared for his guests was simply delicious, salmon carbonara. Charlie and herself were amazed by how good he cooked, and the former was having more good things to say about his daughter's newest boyfriend. It was an enjoyable time for all three of them. So alright folks, that's all for today. Stay tuned for part 5. Do subscribe, like and share for more such videos. Also check out the story and author Asian Lion Heart 310 on fanfiction.net. Press the bell icon to be notified first on release. See you in the next video. Till then, goodbye.